Middle-earth holds more than mountains and rivers. It carries the echoes of forgotten ages. I am your keeper of ancient knowledge, sharing the deeper lore that illuminates even the darkest mysteries. Welcome to the Untold Stories.
In the deep halls of the Woodland Realm, where the roots of ancient beaches delved into earth older than memory, there came a silence that was not peace. It was the third age of Middle-earth, and though the great wars of the elder days had long since passed into legend, shadows stirred once more in the forgotten places of the world. The trees felt it first, as trees always do, a tremor in the deep places, a withering at the edges of their dreams. Legolas Greenleaf, son of Thranduil the Elven King, stood upon the highest platform of his father's realm, where the great malon trees wove their branches into living towers. His keen eyes, grey as winter dawn, gazed eastward through the forest canopy toward the distant line of the misty mountains. The wind carried strange tidings that night, the scent of ash where no fires should burn, the cry of birds fleeing from roosts they had held for centuries, and beneath it all, a whisper that spoke not in words, but in the language of dread. The leaves above him rustled with unease, and Legolas placed his palm against the smooth bark of the malon. Through that touch, he felt the slow pulse of the forest's heart, and within that ancient rhythm, a discord, faint but growing, like a poison spreading through clear water. The trees spoke to him as they spoke to all of his kindred, though few among the elves could hear their voices as clearly as he. Tonight, their song was troubled. "What do you hear, my lord?" came a voice behind him. Legolas turned to see Galion, his father's chief counselor, ascending the winding stair that spiraled around the great trunk. The older elf's face bore the weight of many ages, and his eyes held a wariness that had not been there in the peaceful years before. "The forest dreams unquiet. Dreams," Legolas replied, his voice soft as the whisper of wind through leaves. "Something stirs in the east, beyond the borders of our protection. The trees speak of shadows moving where no shadows should be, of a corruption that touches the very roots of growing things." Galion nodded slowly, for he too had felt the change, though more dimly than the prince whose connection to the woodland ran deeper than most. "Your father summons you to the throne hall. Messengers have come from the borders, rangers of the north, bearing words that echo your own." Legolas looked once more toward the east, where the first pale light of dawn was beginning to touch the mountain peaks. The sight should have brought him comfort, as all sunrises did to the Eldar, but instead he felt only the weight of approaching darkness. In his heart, he knew that the long peace of the Woodland Realm was ending, and that soon he would be called upon to defend not merely his father's kingdom, but something far more precious, the very essence of life itself. The bow at his back, strung with hair from the mane of the sacred white deer of Erin Lasgarlin, seemed to thrum with anticipation. Soon, he sensed, it would sing its song of war once more. But first, he must hear what tidings the dawn had brought, and what counsel his father would give in this hour of growing shadow. With a last touch to the malon's bark, a silent promise that he would return, Legolas followed Galion down into the depths of the Elven King's halls, where ancient wisdom waited to guide them through the darkness that was to come. In the great throne hall of Thranduil, where living wood had been shaped by song and starlight into pillars that reached toward the earth's ceiling, the Elven King sat upon his carven seat of oak and ash. His crown of autumn leaves caught the light of the crystal lamps, and his eyes, ancient as the forest itself, held depths that few could fathom. Before him stood three figures clad in the grey and green of rangers, their cloaks travel-stained and their faces grave with the weight of dark tidings. "My lord," spoke the eldest of the three, his voice carrying the accent of the northern lands, We bring word from the borders of your realm and beyond. The trees along the old forest road grow sick with a malady we cannot name. Their leaves turn black, though it is yet spring, and their roots withdraw deep into the earth as if fleeing from some poison in the air itself. Legolas entered the hall as these words were spoken, and he felt a chill settle upon his heart. What the ranger described matched too closely the unease he had sensed in the forest song. He moved silently to stand beside his father's throne, his keen hearing catching every nuance of the stranger's words. Thranduil's expression remained impassive, but Legolas saw the tightening around his father's eyes, a sign that few save his son would recognize. "Continue," the Elven King commanded, his voice like the whisper of wind through ancient leaves. "There is more, Lord. The old fortress of Dol Guldur, which has stood empty these many years, is empty no longer. Smoke rises from its towers, and shadows move within its walls, shadows that cast no reflection in water and leave no trace upon the ground. The very birds refuse to fly near that cursed place, and the wolves howl songs of lamentation in the night." At these words, a tremor passed through the living pillars of the hall, and the crystal lamps flickered as if responding to some unseen wind. Legolas felt the bough upon his back grow warm, as if awakening from long sleep. In the deep places of his memory, stories stirred, tales of the Second Age, when darkness had last taken root in that fell place, when the enemy had worn fair form and deceived even the wise. "What news from Lothlorien?" Thranduil asked, though, from his tone, Legolas suspected his father already knew the answer would bring little comfort. The second ranger stepped forward, a woman with silver threading her dark hair. "The Lady Galadriel has closed the borders of the Golden Wood. No word comes from the Lord Celeborn, and even the malin trees along the border of their realm stand silent. It is as if a great web of shadow spreads from the south and east, and all who dwell beneath its edge are bound in silence." A long moment passed in the throne hall, broken only by the distant sound of water falling in the depths below. Legolas watched his father's face, seeing there the careful calculation of one who had ruled for 3 ages of the world. Finally, Thranduil spoke, and his words carried the weight of doom. The necromancer returns to his ancient seat. What was driven forth comes back, strengthened by years of malice in exile. The hour grows dark, and darker still it shall become before light returns to this world. He turned his ageless gaze upon his son. "Legolas, ready your bow. We ride at dawn toward the borders, and perhaps beyond. For if shadow grows in strength while the wise remain silent, then it falls to others to stand guard against the coming storm." The crystal lamps dimmed as if in response to his words, and in that dimming, Legolas saw the future stretching out before them like a path through a dark wood, long, perilous, and leading to destinations unknown. Dawn came pale and reluctant to the Woodland Realm, filtering through leaves that seemed to whisper of distant sorrows. Legolas stood ready in the courtyard, where the great roots of the malin trees formed natural archways, his bow strung and his quiver filled with arrows fletched with the grey feathers of eagles. Beside him waited his father's chosen guard, 12 of the kingdom's finest warriors, their armor gleaming like starlight on water, their faces set with the grim determination of those who ride toward uncertain fate. Yet as the morning mist began to lift, revealing the ancient paths that wound through the forest depths, a figure emerged from the shadows that made even the Elven King pause in wonder. Tall and grey he was, leaning upon a staff of ashwood, his broad hat shadowing eyes that held the light of stars. His beard flowed like silver water over robes that had seen many roads and weathered many storms. "Mithrandir," Thranduil spoke, using the grey wizard's name in the ancient tongue. "Your coming was not foretold, yet methinks it was not unexpected." Gandalf the Grey stepped forward, and Legolas saw that the wizard's usual warmth was shadowed by a deep concern. "Indeed, Thranduil Oriferion, for the road I have travelled brings me tidings that match your own, and worse besides. The darkness that stirs in Dol Guldur sends forth tendrils of malice that reach far beyond the borders of your realm. Already the passes of the Misty Mountains echo with the howling of wolves, and creatures that should not walk in daylight venture forth at noon." The wizard's staff tapped against the root-paved ground, and small flowers bloomed where it touched, as if life itself responded to his presence. "I would ask leave to ride with your company, for my path leads to the same dark destination. There are questions that must be answered, and shadows that must be faced with more than sword and bow." Legolas felt a stirring in his heart at these words, for tales of the Grey Wizard had reached even the secluded halls of the Woodland Realm. Here was one who had walked with kings and counseled the wise, who had faced the fire demons of the deep places and emerged victorious. Yet there was something in Gandalf's manner that spoke not of triumph, but of a burden long carried and growing heavier with each passing day. "You are welcome, Mithrandir," Thranduil replied, though his tone suggested that the wizard's presence confirmed fears rather than allayed them. "Yet I would know what brings one of the Astari to seek the shadows of Dol Guldur. That fortress has been accursed since the days when Gil-galad bore the High Kingship, and even the wise have avoided its vicinity." Gandalf's eyes grew distant, as if looking beyond the present moment to times and places far removed. Because the wise have avoided it, perhaps it has grown strong in solitude. There are powers awakening in the world, Elven King, that were thought bound or banished. I fear that what dwells now in that fell place is no mere remnant of ancient evil, but something that grows in strength with each passing season. The company mounted their steeds, horses of the woodland breed, swift and sure-footed, their coats the colour of autumn leaves. Legolas chose a grey mare whose eyes held wisdom and whose step was light as falling snow. As they rode from the courtyard and into the forest proper, he glanced back once at the towers of his father's realm, wondering if he would see them again unchanged. The path they took wound through the heart of the forest, along tracks known only to the Eldar and the eldest of the woodland creatures. Ancient beeches stood sentinel on either side, their massive trunks bearing scars of ages past, their branches interwoven overhead to form a canopy that filtered the sunlight into patterns of gold and green. Yet as they rode deeper into the wild lands, Legolas began to notice signs of the malady the rangers had described. Leaves that curled and blackened at their edges, streams that ran slower than they should, and a silence where birdsong ought to have filled the air. The bough across his back seemed to grow heavier with each mile, as if it sensed the approaching need for its deadly song. 3 days they rode through the declining forest, and with each league eastward, the very air grew heavier with malice. The trees thinned as they approached the borders of the realm, giving way to scrubland and rocky hills, where only the hardiest of plants could find purchase. Here the influence of Thranduil's protection waned, and other darker powers held sway. It was on the evening of the third day that they first beheld their destination. From a ridge overlooking the brown lands that stretched toward the river Anduin, Dol Guldur rose like a canker upon the world's flesh. The hill upon which it stood had once been fair, covered with flowering trees and sweet grasses, but now it was bare stone, black as night, and crowned with towers that seemed to absorb rather than reflect the dying light of the sun. Legolas drew rein beside Gandalf, and together they studied the fortress in the distance. Smoke rose from its highest spire, not the clean smoke of wood fires, but something thick and oily that hung in the air like a stain. Even from this distance, perhaps 5 leagues away, the prince could feel a wrongness that made his very bones ache with cold. "Long has it stood empty," Gandalf murmured, his voice barely audible above the wind that moaned across the barren landscape. Yet now I perceive that empty it was not, merely waiting, growing in strength while the world believed it abandoned to dust and decay. One of the elven warriors approached, his face pale beneath his helm. "My lord Legolas," he said, his voice tight with controlled fear. "The horses will go no further. They refuse the path, and no urging will drive them toward that accursed place." Indeed, as Legolas looked back at their company, he saw that all the steeds stood with ears laid back and nostrils flaring, their eyes rolling white with terror. Even his own grey mare, usually so steady and willing, trembled beneath him and would not step forward despite his gentle urging. "The beasts have more wisdom than their riders," Thranduil observed, though his tone held no rebuke. "We shall make camp here, in what shelter this ridge provides, and continue on foot when dawn comes. I would not have our return delayed by the loss of our mounts to panic." As they made their simple camp, no fires, for they dared not draw attention to their presence, Legolas climbed to the highest point of the ridge and gazed long at the distant fortress. The sun was setting behind them, painting the western sky in shades of gold and crimson. But toward Dol Guldur all was grey and shadow. As darkness fell, he began to see lights moving within the towers. Not the warm glow of torches or the steady light of lamps, but a cold radiance that seemed to pulse with malevolent life. "You see them too," Gandalf said, appearing beside him with the silence that seemed natural to the grey wizard. "The lights that give no comfort, the flames that cast no warmth. There are servants stirring in that place, my young prince, and their master grows bold in his renewed strength." "What manner of enemy do we face?" Legolas asked, though part of him feared the answer. The rangers spoke of shadows without substance, but surely no mere phantom could command such dread from the very earth itself. Gandalf was silent for a long moment, leaning heavily upon his staff as he studied the distant lights. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of ancient knowledge and deeper fears. "There are many names by which he has been known: the necromancer, the sorcerer of Dol Guldur, the enemy in fair form. But I begin to suspect that behind all these masks lies a darker truth, one that the White Council has been reluctant to acknowledge." The wizard turned his piercing gaze upon Legolas, and in those grey eyes the prince saw depths of wisdom and sorrow that spoke of burdens too great for any single heart to bear. "Evil has returned to its ancient seat, young Greenleaf, and I fear that what we face is no less a shadow, but one whose true name would strike terror into the hearts of all who love the light." As if summoned by his words, a great cry arose from the direction of Dol Guldur, a sound that was neither holy beast nor bird, but something far more terrible. It echoed across the desolate lands between ridge and fortress, and at its sound, every member of their company felt ice settle in their veins. Dawn brought no comfort to the company that huddled upon the ridge. The sun, when it finally appeared above the eastern mountains, seemed pale and distant, its light struggling through a haze that had not been there the night before. The very air tasted of ash and corruption, and even the hardy plants that clung to the rocky soil appeared to wither in the grey morning light. Legolas looked upon his companions and saw his own grim resolve reflected in their faces. The elven warriors bore themselves with the dignity of their race, but there was a tightness around their eyes that spoke of fear held carefully in check. Gandalf stood apart, his staff planted in the stony ground, his gaze fixed upon the path that led down from the ridge toward the accursed hill. "From here we go on foot," Thranduil declared, his voice carrying the authority of ages. "The beasts shall remain here under guard. Let 2 of our number stay with the horses, that our retreat may not be cut off by the loss of our mounts." Legolas felt the wisdom in his father's words, yet part of him wondered if any of them would live to require retreat. The bow upon his back seemed to sing with anticipation, and his quiver full of arrows felt lighter than it should, as if they yearned to fly toward their target. They descended from the ridge in single file, following what remained of an ancient road that had once carried merchants and travelers between the havens of the east and the Woodland Realms. But that road was broken now, its stones scattered and its course choked with thorns and briars that grew in unnatural profusion. The very ground beneath their feet felt unstable, as if it might give way at any moment to reveal depths better left unexplored. As they drew nearer to Dol Guldur, the oppression in the air grew heavier. Birds that should have filled the morning with song were nowhere to be seen, and even the insects that typically swarmed in the marshes along the Anduin were absent. It was a silence deeper than death, a void where life itself seemed to have been drained away. The hill of Dol Guldur loomed before them now, its slopes bare of vegetation save for patches of sickly moss that gleamed with an unhealthy phosphorescence. The fortress that crowned it was vast beyond what distance had suggested, its walls built of black stone that seemed to drink in light rather than reflect it. Towers spiraled upward like grasping claws, their windows dark save for the occasional flicker of that cold radiance they had seen the night before. "The main gate stands open," observed one of the elven warriors, his voice barely above a whisper. Indeed, the great portal that should have barred their way hung wide, revealing darkness beyond that seemed to move and shift like living shadow. Gandalf studied the open gateway with eyes that had seen much of evil in his long years. "A trap, perhaps," he murmured, "or an invitation. Either way, we cannot turn back now. Too much depends upon learning what power has taken root in this place." Legolas notched an arrow to his bow, feeling the familiar comfort of the polished yew beneath his palm. Around him, his companions drew their weapons, swords that had been forged in the elder days, their blades inscribed with words of power that had not lost their strength with the passing years. Together they approached the gate of Dol Guldur, their footsteps echoing strangely in the unnatural silence. As they crossed the threshold and entered the fortress proper, the darkness seemed to close around them like water, though they could still see by a dim light that appeared to emanate from the stones themselves. The courtyard within was vast and empty, paved with the same black stone as the walls. At its center stood a well whose depths were lost in shadow, and from which arose an occasional whisper of sound that might have been wind, but somehow suggested voices speaking words in tongues long dead. "Stay close," Gandalf warned, his staff beginning to glow with a soft white light that pushed back the encroaching darkness. In this place, the very stones have memory, and not all of those memories are kind to the living. Above them, the towers of Dol Guldur reached toward a sky that seemed closer than it should, as if the fortress existed in a space separate from the world they knew. And somewhere in those heights, Legolas sensed a presence waited, ancient, malevolent, and growing stronger with each moment that passed. In the depths beneath the courtyard, where stairs carved from living rock descended into darkness older than the fortress above, they found the dungeons of Dol Guldur. The air here was thick with the weight of centuries, heavy with the despair of those who had been brought to this place and never seen light again. Iron doors hung rusted and broken, their locks long since corroded by time and the acid touch of evil. It was Legolas who heard it first, a sound so faint it might have been mistaken for the dripping of water or the settling of ancient stones. But his keen ears, trained by long years in the forest depths, recognized it for what it was, the labored breathing of one who yet lived, though barely. "This way," he whispered, leading the company down a corridor lined with empty cells. The sound grew stronger as they advanced, and with it came a presence that seemed familiar, though Legolas could not place why. Gandalf's staff cast its white light ahead of them, revealing walls blackened with soot and stained with substances better left unnamed. At the end of the corridor, In a cell whose door had been torn from its hinges by some tremendous force, they found him. He sat with his back against the far wall, his once proud frame now bent with suffering, his hair white as snow, though his face bore the features of one still in the prime of life. His clothes, though tattered and stained, had once been rich, the garments of a king. "Water," he whispered as the light fell upon him, raising one trembling hand to shield eyes that had grown accustomed to darkness. "Please, water." Thranduil knelt beside the captive, offering his own water skin with a gentleness that few outside his family had ever witnessed. As the prisoner drank deeply, strength seemed to flow back into his limbs, and his eyes gained focus. When he looked upon his rescuers, recognition dawned in his gaze. "Elves," he breathed, and there was wonder in his voice. "I had not hoped. I had given up hope entirely." "Who are you?" Gandalf asked, though from his tone, Legolas sensed the wizard already suspected the answer. The man straightened as much as his weakened condition would allow, and despite his suffering, there was still dignity in his bearing. "I am Thrain, son of Thror, rightful king under the mountain. Though that mountain has been lost to me these many years, and now I fear it shall never be reclaimed." A chill ran through the company at these words, for the tale of Thrain's disappearance was known even in the halls of the Woodland Realm. He had set out years ago to reclaim Erebor from the dragon Smaug, bearing one of the 7 rings of the Dwarf Lords, and had vanished into the wild lands never to be seen again. "How long have you been held in this place?" Thranduil asked, though his expression suggested he dreaded the answer. Thrain's eyes grew distant, as if trying to pierce through years of darkness and torment. "Time has no meaning in this accursed place. Seasons pass unnoticed. Years flow like water. But I have been here since my ring was taken from me." His hand went instinctively to his finger, where a pale band of skin showed where a great ring had once rested. The necromancer. He wanted the ring. He took it, and with it, much of my strength and will. Gandalf's face grew grave at these words, and Legolas saw the wizard exchange a meaningful look with his father. The capture of one of the 7 rings was more than mere theft. It was a sign that their enemy's power was indeed growing, fed by artifacts of might from the Elder Days. "What have you seen in this place?" Gandalf pressed, his voice gentle but urgent. "What manner of creatures serve the necromancer? What powers does he command?" Thrain shuddered, and for a moment he seemed to retreat into himself, as if the memories were too terrible to bear. "Orcs," he whispered finally. "Orcs beyond counting, but not wild and scattered as they were in the northern wastes. These are organized, disciplined, forged into armies by a will that is iron and fire. And other things? Things that were once fair, twisted into shapes of horror. He has power over the dead, this necromancer. The very stones of this place are alive with malice." "Come," Thranduil said, helping the Dwarf King to his feet. "We must leave this place, and quickly. What you have told us confirms our darkest fears, and this knowledge must reach the White Council before it is too late." But even as they prepared to depart, a sound echoed through the dungeons. The clang of metal on stone, growing closer with each heartbeat. Somewhere in the darkness above, their presence had been discovered, and the servants of the necromancer were moving to cut off their escape. The sound of pursuit grew closer as they helped Thrain through the corridors of the lower dungeons. His strength was returning slowly, but years of captivity had left him weak, and their progress was hampered by his inability to move swiftly. Behind them, the echoes of iron-shod feet rang against stone, and with them came a sound that chilled the blood. The harsh voices of orcs speaking in the black speech, their words full of malice and cruel purpose. "This way," Gandalf urged, his staff blazing brighter as they ascended toward the levels above. "There is another path to the courtyard, one that may yet be clear." But as they reached the ground level of the fortress, a voice spoke from the shadows. a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, resonating through the very stones of Dol Guldur. It was beautiful in its way, melodious and compelling, yet underneath its fair surface lay depths of corruption that made the heart sick with dread. "So," the voice said, and there was amusement in its tone, "the mice have entered the trap of their own will. How considerate of them to save me the trouble of hunting them down." The company halted in the great hall they had entered, weapons drawn, searching the shadows for the source of that terrible voice. But no form could be seen, only a presence that pressed down upon them like a physical weight, making the very air hard to breathe. "I know you, Grey Wanderer," the voice continued, and now it focused upon Gandalf with an attention that was almost palpable. "Mithrandir the Grey, servant of the Secret Fire, bearer of the Ring of Narya. Did you think to enter my domain unnoticed? Did you believe your feeble light could pierce the darkness I have woven here?" Gandalf stood straighter, his staff held before him like a beacon against the pressing shadow. "I know you also, Sauron the Deceiver," he replied, and at that name spoken aloud, the very walls of the Dashigadatsesha fortress seemed to shudder. "Though you wear the mask of the necromancer, I see through your disguise. The time of hiding is ended." Laughter filled the air, not the clean mirth of joy, but something twisted and bitter that spoke of endless malice and patient hatred. "At last, one among you shows wisdom. Yes, I am returned, though I never truly departed. While the kings of men squabbled over their petty kingdoms, and the elves retreated to their fading realms, I have been gathering my strength, forging my servants, preparing for the day when Middle-earth shall bow once more to its rightful master." Legolas felt his bow grow warm in his hands, the string singing with an eagerness to be drawn. Around him his father's warriors stood ready, their swords gleaming with an inner light that spoke of power forged in the elder days. Yet all of them could feel the weight of the enemy's presence, the sheer magnitude of the evil that had taken root in this place. "You have grown bold, Sauron," Thranduil spoke, his voice carrying the authority of one who had stood against darkness before. "But boldness is not wisdom. The free peoples will not suffer your return unopposed." "The free peoples," the voice mocked, and shadows seemed to writhe in the corners of the hall. "What are they to me? Men who fade like flowers in the wind, elves who grow weary of the world and sail away to their western havens, dwarves who delve deep and wake fell things in their greed for gold. You are all passing shadows, while I am eternal." The temperature in the hall began to drop, and frost formed on the ancient stones. From the darkness came the sound of many feet, orcs pouring into the fortress from hidden entrances, surrounding them with a ring of hatred and sharp steel. "But I am curious," Sauron continued, his voice now coming from directly above them, though still no form could be seen. "What brings the son of Thranduil so far from his woodland home? Surely not mere concern for a captured dwarf king?" For a moment, silence stretched between them, broken only by the harsh breathing of the orcs and the distant drip of water on stone. Then Legolas spoke, his voice clear and unwavering despite the terror that pressed upon them all. "I come because the trees cry out in pain, and their song speaks of a poison spreading through the world. I come because the innocent deserve protection from the shadow you would cast over all living things." Again, that terrible laughter echoed through the hall. How noble, how predictable. "But tell me, young prince, when your arrows are spent and your strength fails, when all around you lies in ruin and your father's realm burns, will your noble intentions serve as shield against my wrath?" The shadows began to move, coalescing into shapes of menace, and Legolas knew that words were ending and battle was about to begin. What followed was not battle as mortals understand it. but a clash between powers that had walked the world since its making. Gandalf raised his staff high, and white fire blazed forth from its tip. Not the warm light of hearth or forge, but the cold fire of stars, ancient and implacable. The shadows recoiled from that radiance like living things in pain, and the orcs that had been creeping closer fell back with howls of rage and fear. "You shall not pass," Gandalf cried, his voice ringing with authority that seemed to shake the very foundations of Dol Guldur. "This place has harbored darkness too long. Let light return to cleanse what has been corrupted." But the enemy's power was vast, fed by years of malice and the strength drawn from the rings he had taken. The shadows pressed back against the wizard's light, and where they met, the air itself seemed to burn with colors that had no names. The stone floor cracked beneath their feet, and dust rained down from the ancient ceiling as the fortress shuddered under the weight of their conflict. Legolas felt his bow sing in his hands, and without conscious thought, he drew and loosed arrow after arrow into the press of orcs that sought to overwhelm them, while the greater powers contended above. Each shaft flew true, guided by instinct honed through centuries of woodland hunting, and each found its mark in the throat or heart of one of the enemy's servants. Beside him, his father's warriors fought with the deadly grace of their kind, their swords weaving patterns of light and death in the chaotic darkness. Yet for all their skill, they were outnumbered 10 to 1, and more orcs poured into the hall with each passing moment. Thrain, though weak, had found a weapon among the fallen and fought with the desperate courage of his people. But Legolas could see that their situation was growing desperate. Above the clash of weapons and the cries of battle, two voices rose in contest. Gandalf speaking words of power in the ancient tongue of Valinor, and Sauron answering with syllables that seemed to drip with poison and malice. The very air between them shimmered with heat, and strange lights danced in the shadows. "Your time is ended, grey fool," the voice of the necromancer boomed, and now there was less amusement in it, and more of naked fury. "I am Sauron the Mighty, Lord of the Earth. You are but a servant, and servants may be broken." But Gandalf stood firm against the onslaught, his staff blazing brighter than ever. "I serve the secret fire," he replied, his voice somehow carrying clearly above the chaos of battle. "You are a creature of shadow and flame you shall remain. You have no power here save what fear grants you, and we do not fear." At these words, something seemed to snap in the spiritual fabric of the fortress. The shadows that had been pressing so close suddenly wavered, and for a moment, genuine daylight streamed through cracks that appeared in the walls. In that pure radiance, the orc screamed and cowered, and even Sauron's voice grew uncertain. It was then that Legolas saw his chance. Drawing his bow with all the strength of his woodland heritage, he aimed not at any physical target, but at the heart of the shadow that pressed down upon them all. The arrow he loosed was no ordinary shaft. It was fletched with eagle feathers and tipped with star silver, a relic of the elder days that his father had given him long ago. The arrow sang as it flew, its voice joining with the music of Gandalf's staff and the battle songs of the elven warriors. It pierced the deepest shadow at the center of the hall, and where it struck, a great cry arose, not of pain, but of fury and frustration. "This is not ended," Sauron's voice roared, but already it seemed to be growing distant. "I withdraw for now, but I shall remember each of your faces. The shadow will fall upon all your lands in time, and when it does, you will rue this day." The darkness began to collapse in upon itself, and the orcs, bereft of their master's will, fled shrieking into the depths of the fortress. The oppressive weight that had pressed upon them lifted, and clean air began to flow through the shattered halls of Dol Guldur. Gandalf lowered his staff, its light dimming to a gentle glow, and for a moment his shoulders sagged with weariness. The contest had cost him much, and Legolas could see lines of age that had not been there before etched into the wizard's face. "It is done," Gandalf said quietly. For now, the fortress is cleansed. But he spoke truly. This is not ended. We have won only a respite. Time to prepare for the greater darkness that is to come. Thranduil sheathed his sword and looked around at the ruins of what had been Sauron's stronghold. The trees will breathe easier with this shadow lifted, he said. But you speak of greater darkness. What evil do you foresee? Gandalf's eyes were troubled as he gazed toward the broken windows, where sunlight now streamed freely. Sauron has revealed himself too soon. He will retreat now to his true fortress in Mordor, and there he will marshal his full strength. The war that is coming will make this skirmish seem like children's play. As they prepared to leave the ruins of Dol Guldur behind, Legolas retrieved his star-silver arrow from where it had fallen. The tip was blackened but unbroken, and he wondered if it would be needed again in the dark days ahead. The journey back to the borders of the Woodland Realm passed in contemplative silence. Thrain, though freed from his long captivity, bore scars that went deeper than the flesh. His eyes held a haunted quality that spoke of torments witnessed and endured. Yet, with each league they traveled away from that accursed place, some measure of his strength returned, and by the time they reached the ridge where their horses waited, he could walk unaided. "Where will you go now?" Thranduil asked the Dwarf King as they prepared to part ways. "Your people believe you dead these many years, and Erebor remains in the claws of the dragon." Thrain's weathered face grew thoughtful. "I have much to consider," he replied. "My ring is lost, my strength diminished, but I am not yet ready to surrender hope. Perhaps it is time to seek my son. Young Thorin has a fire in him that might accomplish what I could not." Gandalf, who had been silent since leaving Dol Guldur, looked up sharply at these words. "Your son, tell me of him." "Thorin Oakenshield, we call him now, for he bore that name in the Battle of Azan-ul-Bizar when he used an oak branch as a shield after his own was broken. He leads our people in exile, working the forges of the Blue Mountains, dreaming always of home." Pride and sorrow warred in Thrain's voice. "He is everything a dwarf king should be. Proud, fierce, uncompromising. Perhaps too much so." Something kindled in Gandalf's eyes at this description, and Legolas sensed that the wizard was forming plans whose scope went far beyond their current situation. "Where might I find this Thorin Oakenshield?" Gandalf asked, though his tone suggested the question was more than idle curiosity. After Thrain had departed, walking slowly but steadily toward the Blue Mountains and whatever reunion awaited him there, the company continued their journey homeward. But when they reached the borders of the Woodland Realm, Gandalf did not accompany them into the protective embrace of Thranduil's halls. "My path leads elsewhere," the wizard explained, leaning heavily upon his staff. "The White Council must be told of what we have discovered, and preparations must be made. Sauron has shown his hand too early, perhaps, but that only means the final confrontation draws near." "What would you have us do?" Legolas asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Watch," Gandalf replied simply. "Watch the borders, watch the roads, watch for signs of the enemy's movements. And prepare your people, for when the darkness comes in earnest, it will seek to claim every corner of Middle-earth." 3 days later, in the golden halls of Lothlorien, the White Council gathered in session. Galadriel sat upon her throne of living wood, her hair catching the light like spun gold, her eyes holding depths that had witnessed the glory of Valinor. Beside her stood Celeborn, silent and thoughtful, while Elrond of Rivendell bore upon his noble features the weight of decision. Saruman the White, chief of the Istari, paced before them with measured steps, his staff clicking against the marble floor. "So," Saruman said after Gandalf had finished his account, "the necromancer has revealed himself at last. I confess I had wondered when this moment would come, though I had hoped it might be delayed longer." "You knew?" Gandalf asked, and there was steel in his voice. You knew it was Sauron, and yet counseled patience? Saruman's eyes were cold as winter stone. I suspected, as did we all, but suspicion is not certainty. An action taken too soon can be as harmful as action delayed too long. The enemy has been driven from Dol Guldur. That much is accomplished. Perhaps it is enough. Enough! Galadriel's voice rang like silver bells, but there was no music in it now. My husband and I have defended the borders of our realm against the shadows that crept forth from that place for nigh on 1,000 years. We know better than any the malice that dwelt there. If Sauron has indeed returned to Mordor, then the time of hiding is past for all of us. Elrond nodded gravely. Lady Galadriel speaks truly. We cannot pretend that driving him from one stronghold will end the matter. He will be stronger in Mordor, surrounded by the fires of Mount Doom and the armies he has been gathering in secret. The question now is not whether war will come, but when, and whether we shall be ready for it. Then what do you counsel? Celeborn asked, speaking for the first time in the long debate. Gandalf stepped forward, his grey robes rustling in the gentle breeze that stirred through the malon trees. I counsel that we act, and swiftly. There are matters in motion that may yet turn the tide, if we have the wisdom to guide them properly. What matters? Saruman demanded, but Gandalf's eyes had grown distant, as if seeing futures that had not yet come to pass. A dwarf king who dreams of home, the grey wizard murmured, a mountain that sleeps under dragon fire, and perhaps a small folk whose courage burns brighter than their size would suggest. In the halls of the Woodland Realm, Legolas stood upon his favoured platform among the malon trees, listening to the forest song. The trees sang more peacefully now, their voices clear and strong, but underneath their music he could hear an echo of the darkness they had faced. The shadow had been driven back, but not destroyed, and he knew that greater trials lay ahead for all the free peoples of Middle-earth. In the Blue Mountains, where the remnants of Durin's folk laboured in exile, the forges burned late into the night. The halls carved from living stone echoed with the ring of hammers and the hiss of quenched steel, for the dwarves had never lost their skill in working metal, even in their wandering. Here, in chambers that were grand but held no candle to the glory of Erebor, Thorin Oakenshield held court among his people. He was a dwarf in the prime of his strength, broad-shouldered and proud, with dark hair streaked with early silver and eyes that burned with unquenchable fire. Upon his breast he wore the great chain of his ancestors, though the treasure it once supported, the Arkenstone of Thrain, lay beneath the dragon's hoard in the lonely mountain. When word came that a grey wizard sought audience with him, Thorin received the news with the wariness of one who had learned to trust few outside his own people. Gandalf entered the Dwarf Lord's hall as snow began to fall outside, his staff tapping against the stone floor, his grey robes bearing the dust of many roads. The dwarves who lined the hall watched him with curious eyes, for wizards were rare visitors to their mountain homes, and this one bore himself with an authority that commanded respect. Thorin, son of Thrain, son of Thror, Gandalf said, his voice carrying clearly through the vaulted chamber. I bring word of your father, and perhaps a path to reclaim what was lost. The effect of these words upon Thorin was immediate. The Dwarf Lord rose from his chair, his hand instinctively moving to the hilt of his sword. My father has been dead these 7 years, he said, his voice tight with old grief and newer suspicion. What game do you play, wizard? No game, Gandalf replied gently. Your father lives, though he has suffered much. I myself aided in his rescue from the dungeons of Dol Guldur, where he was held captive by the necromancer for longer than any should endure. The hall fell silent save for the distant sound of forge fires, and Thorin's face went through a dozen emotions before settling into hard lines of contained hope and rage. Captive? For 7 years? Why was no word sent? Why was no rescue attempted? Because we did not know, Gandalf answered simply. The enemy hid his prisoners well, and their suffering was part of his design. But your father is free now, and he spoke much of you, of your strength, your determination, and your dream of home. Thorin's eyes blazed brighter at the mention of home. Erebor, he breathed, the name a prayer and a curse upon his lips. The lonely mountain where my grandfather was king, where the Arkenstone caught the light of moon and star. It lies under dragon fire still, and Smaug the Terrible counts my people's treasure as his bed. Indeed, Gandalf nodded, settling into the chair that Thorin's gesture indicated. But dragons are not immortal, mighty though they may be, and there are paths to victory that do not require armies or great strength of arms. The wizard's words stirred something in the assembled dwarves, a murmur of interest that ran through the hall like wind through grain. For all their skill and courage, they were too few to storm the gates of Erebor by force, and the dragon's fire had proven more than sufficient to turn back the last army that had dared approach the mountain. What path? Thorin demanded, leaning forward in his eagerness. Speak plainly, wizard. What hope do you offer? Gandalf's eyes grew distant, as if looking beyond the present moment to possibilities that hung like spider silk in the web of fate. There is a secret way into the mountain, he said slowly, a door known to your people in the elder days, sealed and hidden but not destroyed. It can be opened, but only at a certain time and with a certain key. From within his robes, the wizard drew forth an object that made every dwarf in the hall catch his breath. A key of silver wrought in the ancient style, its head shaped like a crown and bearing runes that glowed with their own inner light. The key of Erebor, Thorin whispered, reaching out with trembling fingers to touch the precious artifact. My grandfather bore this in the days of our glory. How comes it to be in your possession? Your father gave it to me as we fled from Dol Guldur, Gandalf replied. His last free act before the shadow took him was to ensure that this key would not fall into enemy hands. He entrusted it to me, with instructions that it should pass to you when the time was right. Thorin took the key reverently, feeling its weight and warmth. In his hands it seemed to pulse with life, as if the very metal remembered the kingdom it had once unlocked. You spoke of a certain time, he said, without looking up from the precious object. What time? Durin's day, Gandalf answered, and at those words, several of the older dwarves nodded in understanding. When the thrush knocks and the setting sun with the last light of Durin's day will shine upon the keyhole. Only then can the door be opened. And you believe this will allow us to enter undetected, to bypass the dragon's guard and reclaim our heritage? Gandalf was quiet for a long moment, considering his words carefully. I believe it offers a chance, he said finally. But success will require more than strength and courage. It will require stealth, cunning, and perhaps a touch of the unexpected. The hall erupted in discussion as the dwarves debated this revelation, but Thorin heard none of it. His mind was already racing ahead, planning and calculating, weighing risks against the burning desire that had driven him all his life. Here, at last, was hope. Not certainty, perhaps, but hope enough to justify action. If we were to attempt this, he said, cutting through the chatter of his people, what aid would you offer, Gandalf the Grey? The wizard smiled, and in that expression was both wisdom and something that might have been mischief. Guidance, he said, and perhaps the assistance of someone uniquely suited to the task at hand. Far from the forge-lit halls of the Blue Mountains, in a land where green hills rolled like waves beneath an endless sky, and gardens bloomed in ordered profusion, there lived a creature of such humble appearance that few would mark him as significant in the great affairs of the world. The Shire, as this blessed realm was known, lay wrapped in peace like a child in its mother's arms, protected by the vigilance of the rangers, and blessed with the simple abundance that comes to those who ask little of fate. In the village of Hobbiton, beneath the spreading branches of the party tree, stood a hole in the side of a hill. Not a nasty, dirty, wet hole filled with the ends of worms and an oozy smell, nor yet a dry, bare, sandy hole with nothing to sit down on or to eat, but a hobbit hole, which meant comfort. It had a perfectly round door painted green, with a shiny yellow brass knob in the exact middle, and above the door in neat gold letters were the words, Bilbo Baggins, Esco. Bilbo Baggins was 50 years of age, which for a hobbit meant he was in the very prime of life, though he seemed younger still to eyes accustomed to the long years of elves or the weathered faces of men. He was round and comfortable, as hobbits generally are, with brown curly hair that had not yet begun to thin, and feet that were tough as leather and covered with hair. On this particular morning, he stood in his garden contemplating the state of his runner beans, which were coming along nicely, and wondering whether he should invite the Proudfoots to dinner, or if that would constitute too much excitement for 1 week. Such were the weighty matters that occupied his mind when a shadow fell across his garden gate, and he looked up to see a tall figure in grey robes approaching along the lane. The sight of this stranger filled Bilbo with a peculiar mixture of curiosity and unease, for while hobbits were generally hospitable folk, they were also suspicious of anything that might disturb the comfortable routine of their days. "Good morning," said Bilbo, because it was indeed a fine morning, and he had been raised to be polite even to strangers who appeared uninvited at one's gate. "What do you mean?" said the stranger, stopping and looking at him with eyes that seemed far too keen for comfort. "Do you wish me a good morning, or mean that it is a good morning whether I want it or not? Or that you feel good this morning? Or that it is a morning to be good on?" Bilbo blinked, taken aback by this unexpected analysis of what he had considered a simple pleasantry. "All of them at once, I suppose," he said after a moment's thought, then added with growing confidence, "and a very fine morning for a pipe of tobacco out of doors, into the bargain. If you have a pipe about you, sit down and have a fill of mine. There's no hurry, we have all the day before us." The stranger smiled at this, and suddenly his face was transformed from something vaguely threatening into something almost grandfatherly, though the keen light in his eyes remained. "Thank you very much, Master Baggins. I am Gandalf, and Gandalf means me. Not the wandering wizard who used to tell such wonderful tales at parties?" Bilbo asked, his memory stirring. "Not the fellow who used to make such particularly excellent fireworks? I remember those. Old Took used to have them on Midsummer's Eve. Splendid. They used to go up like great lilies and snapdragons and laburnums of fire and hang in the twilight all evening." "The same," Gandalf confirmed, settling onto the bench beside Bilbo's gate as if he had been invited, which he technically had, though it has been many years since I last visited the Shire. Much has changed in the wide world, though I see that little has altered here, which is as it should be. They sat in comfortable silence for a time, sharing Bilbo's excellent pipeweed and watching the bees work among the flowers. To any observer, they would have presented a picture of perfect contentment, an old hobbit and an old wizard enjoying the simple pleasures of a summer morning. But beneath the surface calm, Gandalf's mind was working, considering and evaluating, weighing the character of this unremarkable creature against the needs of a quest that would test the courage of kings. "Tell me, Master Baggins," Gandalf said at length, "have you ever considered that there might be more to life than comfortable holes and well-tended gardens?" Bilbo nearly choked on his pipe. More? What could be more important than a good breakfast and a tidy pantry, or a garden where everything grows in its proper place and season? Really, Gandalf, for someone reputed to be wise, you ask the most extraordinary questions. But even as he spoke these words, Bilbo felt a strange stirring in his heart, a restlessness that he had carefully buried beneath years of routine and respectability. Once, in his youth, He had dreamed of distant mountains and rushing rivers, of adventures beyond the borders of the Shire. But those dreams had faded with the responsibilities of property ownership and the comfortable certainty of 3 meals a day. Gandalf watched the play of emotions across the hobbit's round face and nodded to himself, as if seeing something that confirmed his suspicions. "Forgive an old wizard's curiosity," he said mildly. "It is merely that I have recently become involved in a matter that requires particular qualities. Courage, yes, but also stealth, quick thinking, and perhaps most importantly, the ability to do what others would consider impossible simply because one doesn't know it can't be done." Bilbo shifted uncomfortably on the bench, sensing that this conversation was heading in directions he wasn't sure he wanted to explore. Yet part of him, the part he had thought safely buried, leaned forward with interest despite his better judgment. "What sort of matter?" he heard himself ask, and immediately regretted the words. Gandalf's smile was mysterious, and perhaps just a little dangerous. "Oh, nothing that need concern a respectable hobbit," he said airily. "Merely the small matter of a dragon, a lost kingdom, and a treasure that has been guarded for 60 years by claws and fire. Nothing at all suited to someone who prefers their adventures in books." And with that, the wizard rose from the bench, tipped his hat, and strode away down the lane, leaving Bilbo Baggins sitting in his garden with his comfortable world suddenly feeling rather small and confining indeed. The seasons turned, and as autumn painted the leaves of Mirkwood in shades of gold and crimson, Legolas found himself drawn once more to contemplation of the future. The trees spoke of changes coming with the winter winds, not the natural cycle of death and rebirth that marked the passage of years, but something deeper and more troubling. In their whispered conversations, he heard echoes of distant drums and the tramp of marching feet, as if great armies were stirring in lands far from the peaceful borders of his father's realm. It was in this season of unease that word came from Gandalf, carried by a raven whose black wings bore it swiftly across the leagues from the western lands. The message was brief but significant. The plan was in motion, and soon the dragon's horde would be challenged by unlikely champions. The wizard requested that Thranduil's people watch the roads and waterways, for events were set to unfold that would ripple across all of Middle-earth. In the Blue Mountains, the forges of the dwarves had burned bright through the summer months, as weapons were reforged and armor mended. Thorin Oakenshield had spent countless hours poring over ancient maps and genealogies, tracing the bloodlines of his people and the secret paths that led to Erebor. The key that Gandalf had brought him never left his side, and often he would hold it up to the light, watching the runes glow with their inner fire as if they held promises of glory yet to come. "Balin," he called to his elderly counselor one evening as they sat beside the great hearth in his hall. "Tell me again of the hidden door. What do the old songs say of its location?" Balin stroked his white beard thoughtfully, his eyes distant with memory. "The songs speak of a smooth wall behind the westward shoulder of the mountain, marked by the sign of Durin, but invisible to those who do not know where to look. When the thrush knocks and the setting sun with the last light of Durin's day shines upon the keyhole, then the door will be revealed and the path opened." "And you believe this to be more than mere legend?" "I believe," Balin said carefully, "that our ancestors were not given to idle tales when it came to matters of survival. The hidden door was built for desperate times, when the front gates might be watched or warded. If any of the old ways remain viable, it would be that one." Thorin nodded, his fingers tracing patterns on the arm of his chair. Around them, the hall had grown quiet, as the other dwarves listened to this familiar discussion with the patience of those who had heard it many times, but found it no less compelling for its repetition. 13, Thorin said suddenly, and Balin raised an eyebrow in question. The songs speak of 13 as a number of significance in the old tales. 13 dwarves to reclaim the mountain, led by the rightful king. "Aye," Balin agreed. though we are but 12 here in exile, counting yourself. Where shall we find the 13th? It was then that a knock came at the door of the hall. Not the heavy fist of a dwarf or the measured rap of a man, but something lighter and more hesitant. Glóin rose to answer it and returned moments later with a most unexpected visitor. Gandalf entered the hall as he had before, but this time he was not alone. Behind him came a figure so unlikely that several of the dwarves rubbed their eyes to be sure they were not dreaming. It was a hobbit, round, comfortable, and utterly out of place among the stern warriors and ancient weaponry that filled the chamber. "Master Baggins," Gandalf announced with obvious satisfaction, "allow me to present Thorin Oakenshield." "King under the mountain, Thorin, this is Bilbo Baggins of the Shire, your 14th member." 14th? Thorin's voice was sharp with confusion. "You said 13. 13 is indeed a lucky number," Gandalf agreed blandly, "but 14 is considerably more practical. Master Baggins brings skills that warriors cannot provide: stealth, cunning, and the invaluable ability to go unnoticed. Dragons, you see, are familiar with the scent of dwarf and the tread of armed men. But hobbits," he gestured at Bilbo, who was looking around the hall with a mixture of wonder and growing alarm. "Hobbits are quite outside their experience." Bilbo cleared his throat nervously. "Excuse me," he said in his most polite voice, "but I believe there may be some misunderstanding. I haven't actually agreed to anything involving dragons or mountains or, well, any sort of adventure really. I was merely curious about treasure," Gandalf finished smoothly. "About the chance to see wonders beyond the borders of the Shire, to walk paths that few have trodden and witness the restoration of an ancient kingdom. About becoming part of a legend that will be sung for generations." "Actually," Bilbo said weakly, "I was rather hoping you might explain about the dragon before I—" But his words were drowned out by the sudden activity that erupted in the hall as the dwarves began pulling out maps and pointing to landmarks, their voices rising in excitement as they debated routes and timing. In the center of it all, Thorin sat regarding this unlikely addition to their company, with eyes that held calculation and a growing glimmer of hope. Perhaps, the Dwarf King thought, the wizard knew something about impossible tasks that they did not, and perhaps, in matters of stealth and cunning, a creature who had never held a sword might succeed where warriors had failed. As the night wore on and the plans took shape, none of them could have guessed that their small expedition would set in motion events that would shake the very foundations of the world, or that the quiet hobbit who sat in their midst would prove to be the thread upon which the fate of all free peoples would hang. In the depths of the lonely mountain, where gold lay heaped in chambers, vast as caverns, and precious stones caught what little light filtered down from heights above, something stirred that had slumbered for decades in the contentment of the miser. Smaug the mighty, Smaug the impenetrable, Smaug the unassailable, Smaug the terrible, felt the first tremor of unease that had disturbed his rest since the day he had claimed Erebor as his own. It was not a sound that woke him, nor any disturbance in the physical realm. Rather, it was a change in the very air of the world, a shift in the currents of fate that dragons, with their ancient wisdom and malevolent cunning, could sense as clearly as sharks smell blood in the water. Somewhere, plans were being made that concerned him. Somewhere, enemies were gathering with thoughts of his destruction. The great golden eye opened like a furnace door, casting its baleful light across the treasure chamber, where he lay coiled upon his bed of coins and gems. Each scale upon his hide was the size of a warrior's shield, harder than the finest mail and proof against any weapon forged by mortal hands. His length was such that when fully extended, he could have wrapped himself around the mountain's peak, and his wings, when spread, could blot out the sun itself. "Thieves," he rumbled, the word emerging from his throat like the sound of distant thunder. "I smell them in the wind. I hear them in the whispering of the stones. They think to creep upon me in my rest, to steal what is mine by right of conquest." He raised his great head, and the movement sent cascades of gold flowing like water around his massive form. The air in the chamber grew thick with heat as his inner fires began to kindle, and the precious stones embedded in the walls reflected his rage in 1,000 glittering points of light. For 60 years he had lain here undisturbed, master of all he surveyed, king of gold and silver, emperor of emerald and diamond. The dwarves who had once called this place home were scattered to the winds, their king dead and their armies broken. The men of Dale had fled when the city burned, and their descendants cowered in the shadow of his wrath. No force in Middle-earth had dared to challenge his claim, and he had grown comfortable in his solitude. But comfort, he now realized, had perhaps made him careless. While he slumbered, the world had continued to turn, and new threats had emerged to challenge what was his. The very thought filled him with a fury that had been cold and calculating, but now burned white-hot with indignation. "Let them come," he hissed, and where his breath touched the treasure around him, the metal began to glow with heat. "Let them creep and crawl and scheme in their holes. I am Smaug, I am fire, I am death. What blade can pierce my hide? What force can stand against my flame?" Yet even as he spoke these words of defiance, a part of his ancient mind, the part that had made him the last and greatest of the fire drakes of the north, whispered warnings. Dragons were not immortal, despite their boasts. The great Glaurung had fallen to the sword of Turin Turamba. Ancalagon the Black had been cast down by Erendil and his flying ship. Even the mighty had weaknesses, and enemies who learned those weaknesses could prove dangerous beyond their apparent strength. He began to move through his hoard with restless energy, counting and recounting his treasure with the obsessive attention of one to whom every coin was precious. His memory of the vast wealth was perfect. He knew the location of every cup, every necklace, every ring that lay within his domain. If so much as a single piece went missing, he would know it instantly. "The Arkenstone," he murmured, pausing before a pedestal where the great gem caught and reflected the light of his burning eyes. "The heart of the mountain. They will come for you most of all, my precious. You are what they desire above all else, the symbol of their ancient kingship." The stone seemed to pulse with inner fire as he spoke, and for a moment, Smaug fancied he could see shapes moving within its crystalline depths. Armored figures with axes and hammers marching to war beneath banners that bore the sign of Durin. But when he looked more closely, there was nothing but the gem's natural beauty and the reflection of his own terrible visage. The dragon settled back upon his hoard, but sleep would not come easily now. His great eye remained open, scanning the shadows and listening to every sound that echoed through the mountain's depths. Somewhere in the world above, his enemies were planning his destruction, and he would be ready for them. Let them come with their swords and their courage. Let them bring fire to match his fire and steel to test his scales. He was Smaug the Mighty, and he had not held the lonely mountain for 60 years by being merciful to those who would challenge his rule. In the halls of the Woodland Realm, Legolas felt the distant stirring as a tremor in the forest song. The trees spoke of fire awakening in the east, of ancient malice roused to wakefulness. Something vast and terrible had begun to move in the deep places of the world, and he knew that the time of peace was drawing to its close. While dragonfire stirred in the depths of Erebor and dwarves plotted in the halls of their exile, darker powers moved in the shadowed lands that lay beneath the weight of Sauron's malice. Though the necromancer had been driven from Dol Guldur, his retreat had been strategic rather than desperate, a withdrawal to strongholds where his true strength lay dormant, waiting for the proper moment to reveal itself to the world. In Mordor, where the very air was thick with ash and the sky was lit by the fires of Mount Doom, the great fortress of Barad-dûr rose like a black needle against the burning heavens. Here, behind walls that no mortal army could breach, the Dark Lord gathered his strength for the war that was to come. Orcs bred in the deep pits of the earth, multiplying like vermin in conditions that would have killed any creature born under the light of the sun. Nazgûl stirred in their tombs, preparing to ride forth once more when their master's call should come. But it was not only in the traditional strongholds of evil that Sauron's influence grew. In Isengard, where the circle of Orthanc stood like a tower of white bone against the green fields of Rohan, Saruman the White pursued his own designs with the single-minded determination of one who believed himself to be the wisest of his order. The wizard who had once counseled patience now worked with feverish intensity, convinced that the time for half measures was past. The grey fool meddles where he should not, Saruman muttered as he paced the chamber at the top of Orthanc, his white robes rustling in the wind that moaned through the tower's heights. Before him, spread across a table of black marble, lay maps and charts showing the movements of armies and the locations of strategic fortresses. He stirs up dangers that might have slept for decades more, forces events before we are prepared to control them. Through the palantir that sat like a dark crystal upon its pedestal, Saruman had communed with powers that promised him dominion over the chaos to come. The eye that looked out from Barad-dûr saw far and knew much, and it had whispered to him of opportunities that would arise when the old order finally crumbled. But such opportunities required careful preparation and absolute timing. Let him play his games with dwarves and dragons, the White Wizard continued, his voice growing harder with each word. While he wastes his strength on such diversions, I shall prepare for the real war. When Sauron reveals himself openly and the kingdoms of men fall into disarray, those with the wisdom to have prepared shall inherit the earth. In the furnaces beneath Orthanc, his new servants, creatures that had once been orcs but were now something more disciplined and deadly, worked to forge weapons of a quality their crude ancestors could never have achieved. The Uruk-hai, as they were called, stood taller than common orcs and bore themselves with the bearing of true soldiers rather than mere raiders. When they marched to war, they would do so with purpose and coordination that would surprise those who expected the scattered rabbles of the past. Yet even as Saruman plotted and prepared, other forces moved in the world that lay beyond his calculations. In the depths of Mirkwood, spiders of unusual size and malevolence began to stir, their poison growing more potent and their numbers increasing with each passing season. The necromancer's influence had not been entirely purged from that realm, and what remained was taking new and more dangerous forms. Along the borders of Lothlorien, where the Golden Wood met the darker forest to the east, patrols of the Galadrim reported strange sightings. Wolves that ran upright like men, birds that spoke in tongues that hurt the ear to hear, and shadows that moved independently of any object that might cast them. The malice that had been concentrated in Dol Guldur was spreading like ink in water, touching everything it encountered with corruption. In Rohan, the horse lords noticed that their steeds grew restless in the night, snorting and stamping as if they sensed predators in the darkness. Wolves howled in the distance where no wolves should be, and strange lights were seen dancing on the horizon when the moon was dark. The Rohirrim, who prided themselves on their mastery of the grasslands, found that their horses would no longer venture into certain valleys or graze in pastures that had been safe for generations. Even in the distant havens of the Elves, where the ships of the firstborn waited to carry their people into the west, there was unease. Gerdan the shipwright stood upon the quays of the grey havens and watched the sunset paint the sea in shades of gold and crimson. But his ancient eyes saw storm clouds gathering on horizons that were still clear to mortal sight. The time draws near, he murmured to the wind that brought him news from across the water. The final test approaches, and all the peoples of Middle-earth must choose their allegiance. There will be no neutrality in the war that comes, no safe harbors for those who would remain aloof from the struggle. Yet in all this gathering darkness, there remained lights that burned undimmed. In Rivendell, Elrond kept counsel with the wise and prepared for whatever role the hidden valley might play in the trials ahead. In Lothlorien, Galadriel tended her mirror and watched the paths of possibility branch and merge like streams flowing toward an unknown sea. And in the Shire, where hobbits tended their gardens and baked their bread in blessed ignorance of the world's troubles, a small light burnt that would prove brighter than any of the great powers suspected. For sometimes it is the smallest flame that kindles the greatest fire, and the humblest heart that holds the courage to change the world. The autumn winds carried news across Middle-earth like leaves scattered from a mighty tree, and those with the wisdom to read such signs felt the world shift upon its foundations. From the north came word that shook the councils of the wise and set armies marching. Smaug the Terrible was dead, and the kingdom under the mountain was restored. It had begun, as great events often do, with the smallest of actions. A hobbit, small, quiet, and utterly unremarkable to those who measured worth by sword skill or royal blood, had crept into the dragon's hoard with a courage born of desperation and a cleverness that Smaug's arrogance had not anticipated. What followed was a chain of events that would be sung in the halls of kings for ages to come. The theft of a golden cup, the dragon's rage, the ruin of Lake Town, and finally, the fell drake's death by a black arrow loosed from the bow of Bard the bowman. But victory came with a price that was higher than mere gold. The death of Smaug had awakened older hungers, and armies converged upon Erebor like vultures drawn to carrion. Elves marched from the Woodland Realm, seeking recompense for ancient wrongs. Men came from the ruins of Lake Town, demanding a share of the treasure that had cost them their homes. And from the north came a host of dwarves led by Dain Ironfoot, answering his kinsman's call for aid. In the halls of Thranduil's palace, Legolas stood at his father's side as the Elven king prepared for war. The army that assembled in the forest clearings was a sight to stir the heart. Ranks of warriors clad in armor that caught the light like moonbeams on water, their spears and swords forged in the ancient days when the world was younger. Yet beneath the martial splendor, there was a sadness that touched all who witnessed it. For this might be the last time such a host would march under the banners of the Woodland Realm. "My son," Thranduil said as they rode at the head of the column, the autumn leaves crunching beneath their horses' hooves, "you have felt the stirring of greater evils than any dragon. Tell me truly, do you believe this quest for treasure is worth the blood it will cost?" Legolas was quiet for a long moment, listening to the forest song as it followed them through the changing woods. "I believe," he said finally, "that some battles must be fought, not because we desire them, but because failing to fight them would cost us more than victory ever could. The kingdom under the mountain is more than gold and jewels. It is a symbol that the ancient lights have not all been extinguished." They reached the ruins of Dale as the sun set behind them, painting the desolate landscape in shades of gold and crimson. The ancient city lay broken upon the plain before Erebor, its towers fallen and its streets choked with the debris of decades. Yet even in its ruin, there was a grandeur to the place that spoke of better days, when men and dwarves had traded in peace, and the mountain's wealth had blessed all who dwelt in its shadow. The Battle of Five Armies, as it came to be known, was brief but terrible. Orcs and wargs poured down from the grey mountains in numbers that darkened the earth, led by Azog the Defiler and his son Bolg, seeking to claim the mountain and its treasure for themselves. Against them stood the combined might of three peoples who had been enemies moments before, but now fought side by side against a common foe. Legolas rode with the van of his father's cavalry, his bow singing its deadly song as arrow after arrow found its mark in orcish hearts. Beside him fought Tauriel, the captain of his father's guard, her twin blades weaving patterns of death among their enemies. The prince's skill was such that bards would later claim he never missed his target, that his arrows flew like silver lightning and struck with the force of thunderbolts. Yet it was not the prowess of any single warrior that won the day, but the courage of the smallest among them. When the tide of battle seemed to turn against the free peoples, when Thorin Oakenshield lay wounded and his line began to waver, Bilbo Baggins, armed with nothing but a small sword and a mail shirt that was too large for him, threw himself into the fray with a valor that shamed greater warriors. The Hobbit's intervention turned the battle's tide not through strength of arms, but through an act of mercy that saved a life and forged an alliance. When the goblin chieftain Azog fell to Thorin's blade in single combat, and Bolg sought to complete his father's work of vengeance, it was Bilbo's warning cry that saved the dwarf king from a spear thrust from behind. In the end, when the last orc had fled or fallen, the field was littered with the dead of 5 armies. Victory had been won, but at a cost that left all the survivors sobered. Thorin Oakenshield bore wounds that would trouble him for the rest of his days. Thranduil's host had suffered losses that left gaps in ranks that had stood unbroken for centuries, and the men of Laketown found themselves inheritors of a Pyrrhic triumph. Yet, as the sun rose over the battlefield on the morning after victory, something had changed in the world that went beyond mere politics or treasure. The kingdom under the mountain was restored, its gates once more open to trade and friendship. The ancient bonds between the free peoples had been renewed in fire and blood, and those who had fought together would remember that alliance when darker times came. In the great throne hall of Erebor, where Thorin sat once more upon the throne of his fathers, a new age began. But even as the dwarves celebrated their homecoming and the mountain rang with the sound of hammers on anvils, shadows gathered in the east that would make the Battle of 5 Armies seem like a skirmish between children. Sauron's hour was approaching, and all the victories in the world would not long delay the coming of the darkness. In the depths of the misty mountains, where goblin tunnels wound through stone older than the memory of elves, something stirred that had lain hidden since the elder days. Deep beneath the roots of the mountains, in a cavern carved by waters that had long since found other courses, the creature that had once been called Smeagol crouched beside a dark pool and spoke to himself in voices that were both one and many. "Precious," he whispered, his pale hands trailing in the black water where blind fish swam in endless circles. "My precious is gone, stolen, taken by the nasty burglar hobbit. But he cannot have gone far, no, not far at all. We knows the ways, precious, we knows how to find what was lost." For 60 years he had dwelt in the darkness, sustained by fish and fungi, and the malice that burned in his heart like a cold flame. The ring that had been his treasure and his curse for centuries beyond counting had been torn from him by the small hands of a burglar, and in its absence, he felt a hunger that gnawed at his spirit like acid. Yet in that very hunger, he found purpose: to find the thief, to reclaim what was his, to make the precious safe once more. But the ring, the golden circle that contained within its small compass the power to rule all the other rings of power, had not been idle in the hands of its new bearer. In the comfortable hobbit hole of Bag End, where Bilbo Baggins had returned to the quiet life he thought he craved, the simple gold band sat innocently upon a desk, or rested forgotten in a drawer, giving no sign of the vast malice that slumbered within its perfect curve. Yet those with the wisdom to see beyond the surfaces of things might have noticed changes in its bearer. Bilbo aged more slowly than he should, his hair remaining thick and his step light though the years passed. His neighbors thought him merely well preserved, but sometimes when he thought no one was looking, His hand would stray to the pocket where he kept his magic ring, and his eyes would grow distant with thoughts of places far from the Shire. He spoke little of his adventure, save to his young cousin Frodo, who had come to live with him after the death of his parents. To the lad he told tales of trolls and goblins, of eagles and dragons, but of the ring he said only that it was a small treasure he had found in the dark places of the world, a memento of his travels that helped him remember that there were wonders beyond the borders of Hobbiton. But memories were not all that the ring preserved. In its golden heart, it held the malice of its creator, and though Sauron could not perceive its exact location, he felt its presence in the world like a constant itch between his spiritual shoulder blades. The ring was awake now, stirring with power that grew stronger as its creator's strength returned, and it whispered to its bearer in dreams and quiet moments when the mind was unguarded. "Keep me safe," it seemed to say without words. "Keep me secret. Let no one know of my existence, for there are those who would take me from you and use me for evil purposes. I am yours alone, your precious treasure, and together we shall have such adventures." The influence was subtle, working upon the natural hobbit love of comfort and security, twisting it into possessiveness and secretiveness. Bilbo began to lock his door more often to avoid visitors who might ask too many questions about his past. He started a book about his adventure, but found himself reluctant to write certain parts of it, particularly anything that might hint at the true nature of his birthday present. In Rivendell, where Elrond half-elven kept watch over the borders between the wild lands and the civilized realms, the Lord of the Hidden Valley felt a growing unease that he could not entirely explain. Something had changed in the world's harmony, a discord so subtle that only the keenest ears could detect it. In his dreams, he sometimes glimpsed a golden circle spinning in darkness, but when he woke, the details faded like morning mist. Far to the south, in the depths of Minas Morgul, where the Nine had once held court before their master's fall, shadows stirred that had not moved since the last alliance. The Nazgul were returning to their ancient seats of power, drawn by the growing strength of the ring and their master's approaching revelation. Soon they would ride forth again under the banner of the Lidless Eye, seeking that which was lost and bringing terror to all who stood in their path. Yet for now, the ring slept in the pocket of a hobbit who thought it nothing more than a curious bauble, useful for avoiding unwanted guests and occasionally amusing children with tricks of invisibility. The fate of Middle-earth hung upon the whims of a creature who wanted nothing more than good meals, comfortable chairs, and the respect of his neighbors. In Moria, where Durin's folk had delved too greedily and too deep, something else stirred in response to the ring's awakening. A shadow and flame that had slumbered since the dwarves fled in terror. The Balrog of Morgoth felt the change in the world's substance, and knew that the time of hiding was nearly done. Soon, very soon, the ancient powers would walk openly under the sun, and all the careful peace of the Third Age would crumble like sandcastles before the tide. But in the Shire, the seasons turned and the harvests were gathered, and Bilbo Baggins sat by his fire in the evening, reading books of old lore and sometimes touching the ring in his pocket with fingers that trembled slightly, though he could not have said why. The darkness was gathering, but it gathered slowly, and for now there was still time for tea and seed cake and the comfortable illusion that the world beyond the borders was someone else's concern. How wrong that comfortable illusion would prove to be, none could yet foresee. But the wise watched and waited, knowing that the final act of the long drama was about to begin. As winter deepened and the first snows began to fall upon the peaks of the misty mountains, the White Council convened once more in the halls of Lothlorien. The golden light of the malin trees seemed dimmer now, as if the very air were weighted with the shadow of things to come. Around the circle of seats carved from living wood sat the greatest of the wise, Galadriel in her silver gown that caught starlight, Elrond bearing the weariness of ages in his noble features, Gandalf leaning upon his staff with eyes that had seen too much, and Saruman standing apart from the others with an air of barely contained impatience. "The time has come," Galadriel announced, her voice carrying the authority of one who had walked in the light of the two trees. "Our enemy grows bold in his southern fortress, and the shadow spreads from Mordor like poison in a wound. If we wait longer, Dol Guldur will become too strong to assault, a second anchor for his malice in the north." Saruman nodded curtly, his white robes rustling as he moved to the center of the circle. "At last, wisdom prevails. The fortress must be cleansed before it can serve as a rallying point for the armies of darkness. I have prepared extensively for this moment. The assault shall be swift and decisive." But Gandalf's face was troubled as he looked upon his fellow wizard. "Prepared extensively? What preparations have you made without the knowledge of this council?" "The preparations necessary to ensure victory," Saruman replied coolly. "I have studied the defenses of Dol Guldur, learned the nature of the creatures that garrison it, and forged weapons capable of striking at the very heart of shadow. When we move against the fortress, we shall not merely drive out its master. We shall purge it so thoroughly that no evil will ever again find purchase in its stones." The assault, when it came, was unlike any battle that had been fought since the last alliance. The White Council moved against Dol Guldur with all the power at their command. Galadriel's light blazing like a star descended to earth. Elrond's voice raised in words of command that made the very stones tremble, and Saruman wielding fire and force with a skill that amazed even his fellow Istari. Legolas stood with the army of his father upon the borders of the forest, watching as lights flashed and thundered in the distance where the ancient fortress stood. The trees around them swayed without wind, their branches reaching toward the battle as if drawn by some irresistible force. The very air crackled with power released, and more than once the prince felt his bow grow warm at his back, responding to magics that operated beyond the understanding of any save the firstborn. "Look there!" Thranduil commanded, pointing with his sword toward the highest tower of Dol Guldur. "Do you see it?" Indeed, Legolas could see what his father indicated, a great shadow rising from the fortress like smoke, but smoke that moved with purpose and malevolent intelligence. It writhed and coiled as it climbed toward the storm-tossed sky, and from its depths came sounds that were not quite music and not quite screaming. "He flees," the Elven King said with satisfaction. "The necromancer abandons his northern stronghold rather than face the combined might of the council. The fortress is cleansed." But even as the words left his lips, both father and son felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter wind. The shadow in the sky was not dispersing. It was consolidating, gathering itself for a leap across the vast distances that separated Dol Guldur from other, darker places. This was not defeat, but strategic withdrawal. The calculated retreat of a power that knew it could not win this battle, but was already planning the next. "He goes to Mordor," Legolas said quietly, and his words carried the weight of prophecy. "The necromancer reveals himself at last and takes up residence in his true seat of power. The time of hiding is ended." In the ruins of Dol Guldur, Saruman walked alone through chambers that had been cleansed by fire and starlight. The stones still bore scorch marks from the battle, and in places the very walls had been melted and reformed by forces too powerful for physical matter to contain. Yet as he moved through the devastated fortress, the White Wizard's expression was not one of triumph, but of calculation. In what had been the highest chamber of the central tower, where the necromancer had held court among his servants, Saruman found what he had truly come seeking. Hidden beneath rubble and ash, protected by wards that had somehow survived the council's assault, lay a palantir, one of the seeing stones of Numenor, black as night and cold as winter. At last, he murmured, lifting the stone with hands that trembled slightly despite his power. The key to seeing beyond the present moment, to knowing what moves in the mind of the enemy himself. But as his fingers closed around the ancient artifact, Saruman felt a presence touch his mind. Vast, patient, and utterly alien to any good thing. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, he found himself looking into the lidless eye itself, and in that burning gaze, he saw not the defeat of evil, but the promise of power beyond imagining for those wise enough to choose the winning side. When the White Council reconvened in the aftermath of their victory, Saruman spoke with eloquent satisfaction of the fortress's cleansing and the dispersion of its evil. He made no mention of the Palantir that now rested in a place of honor within the circle of Orthanc, nor of the whispers that had begun to echo in his dreams. The battle was won, but as the members of the council departed to their various realms, each carried with them the knowledge that this victory had been bought at a price they could not yet calculate. The shadow had not been destroyed, merely driven to ground more suited to its nature. And in the hearts of the wise, there stirred the premonition that when next they faced their ancient enemy, he would be stronger than they had ever imagined, and they themselves might find their unity tested by temptations they had not foreseen. Winter deepened, and in the halls of Orthanc, Saruman the White began the long process of becoming Saruman of many colors, though he did not yet realize the magnitude of his fall. Spring came late to Middle-earth in the year that followed the cleansing of Dol Guldur, as if the very seasons hesitated to embrace a world where shadows gathered like storm clouds on distant horizons. Yet when the first green shoots broke through the forest floor and the malon trees began to bud with new leaves, there was something in their stirring that spoke not of ending, but of beginning. Legolas walked the borders of his father's realm in those days, listening to the forest song and finding in it melodies he had not heard before. The trees spoke of change coming, not the slow change of seasons or the patient growth of years, but the swift turning of ages that would remake the world in ways both wonderful and terrible. In their whispered voices, he heard echoes of older songs, the music of the elder days when the Silmarils blazed in the crown of Elendil and the hosts of Gil-galad marched to war beneath banners that caught starlight. The Third Age draws toward its close, he said to his father as they stood together on the platform where this tale had begun, watching the sun set through leaves that danced with inner light. I can feel it in the wind and hear it in the voices of the birds. The long peace is ending, and what comes after will test every oath and challenge every friendship. Thranduil nodded slowly, his ancient eyes reflecting depths of memory that stretched back through centuries of joy and sorrow. Yet in every ending lies the seed of a new beginning, he replied. The darkness that gathers in the east is mighty, but it is not the only power that stirs in the world. There are lights that burn in unlikely places, and courage that grows strongest in the smallest hearts. Far to the west, in the green hills of the Shire, where smoke still rose from comfortable chimneys and gardens bloomed in ordered profusion, Bilbo Baggins sat in his study, writing the final chapters of a book he had titled There and Back Again, A Hobbit's Tale. The pages before him chronicled adventures that seemed like dreams now. So far removed were they from the quiet routine of Bag End. Yet sometimes when the light fell just so across the parchment, he would pause in his writing and touch the golden ring that lay innocently beside his inkwell. Strange how such a small thing can carry such weight, he murmured to himself, not fully understanding why the simple band seemed heavier in his hand than reason would suggest. I wonder sometimes if I shall have need of it again, or if my adventuring days are truly done. But the ring, for all its seeming innocence, had begun to work its subtle influence upon its bearer. In the margins of his book, Bilbo found himself writing verses that he did not remember composing. Lines about roads that went ever on and on, about mountains crowned with fire, and about burdens that must be carried though the heart break beneath their weight. When he tried to trace the source of these additions, he found that he could not remember writing them, though the hand was unmistakably his own. In Rivendell, where the last homely house stood as a sanctuary against the growing darkness of the world, Elrond sat in his study reading prophecies written in scripts older than the realms of men. The words spoke of a time when the smallest hands would hold the fate of all the great, when humble courage would triumph where the valor of kings had failed, and when the breaking of one small circle would either damn or save the world. A halfling's hope, he read aloud, tracing the ancient elvish letters with one finger. In the hour of greatest darkness, when all seems lost and the shadow covers the earth, look for the small folk who walk unseen and carry burdens beyond their strength. For in their simple love of growing things and peaceful days lies a power that the wise cannot fathom and the mighty cannot break. The prophecy spoke truly, though none yet understood its full meaning. For in the Shire, young Frodo Baggins helped his uncle tend the garden of Bag End, learning the names of flowers and the proper time for planting beans, never dreaming that his small hands would one day hold the fate of all Middle-earth. He was a thoughtful lad, given to long walks in the countryside and conversations with the elves who sometimes passed through the Shire on their way to the Grey Havens. It was to Frodo that Bilbo told the truest versions of his tales, speaking not only of dragon gold and riddles in the dark, but of the deeper lessons learned on the road between there and back again. Remember, the old hobbit would say as they sat by the fire on winter evenings, that even the smallest person can change the course of the future, not by strength or cunning, but by holding fast to what is right when all the world seems bent on wrongness. In the depths of Moria, where Durin's folk had once delved in search of Mithril, the Balrog of Morgoth stirred in response to vibrations that ran through the very bones of the earth. The ancient demon felt the approach of times that would wake all the old powers, and its fire-wreathed form began to move through the abandoned halls with purpose born of patience measured in millennia. And in Mordor, where the eye of Sauron gazed out from the pinnacle of Barad-dûr, plans took shape that would soon bring war to every corner of Middle-earth. Yet even as the Dark Lord marshalled his armies and prepared to reclaim dominion over all the lands, he could not perceive the small golden circle that lay forgotten in a hobbit's study, or guess that his doom would come not from the swords of kings, but from the determination of the humblest folk in all the world. The season turned, and across the fields of the Shire, farmers planted seeds that would grow into bread for the hungry and flowers for those who loved beauty. In that simple act of faith, the belief that tomorrow would come and bring with it the need for harvest, lay a hope more powerful than all the artifice of sorcerers or the stratagems of generals. For hope, like the seed in darkness, needs only the smallest crack in despair to send forth shoots that will eventually break stone and cover the world with green. And in the hearts of the free peoples, that hope burned steady and bright, though they knew not yet how greatly they would need its light in the days that were to come. The Song of the Bow was not yet ended, though its greatest verses were still to be written. And in the deep places of the earth and the high halls of the sky, powers ancient and mighty prepared for the final movement of a symphony that had been playing since the music of creation first gave shape to the void. The Third Age was ending, but what would rise from its ashes remained to be seen. Thus ends the first chronicle of Legolas Greenleaf, Prince of the Woodland Realm, though his greatest trials and victories yet lay ahead in the darkness that was to come. For this was but the overture to a greater song, the War of the Ring, when all the free peoples would stand together against the shadow, and a hobbit's courage would kindle fires that would burn until the end of days.